I am so excited about this panel because we have three amazing guests, panelists today. So if I may quickly introduce themselves. So Nori is the founder of Kotoba Technology, which is an AI voice model used for simultaneous translation, as well as speech-to-text, text-to-speech, and so forth. So if you are Japanese, and I would really recommend for you to use his app called Kotoba. It's available in the App Store. I was using it during the previous session, and it translates like almost perfectly between Japanese, English, as well as other languages as well. He can provide the perspective from the founder's view. We also have Anne, who is a founding partner at Floodgate, which is a very prominent seed stage VC based in the Valley. She's also a regular at the Midas list, which is the top 50 venture capital ranking in the world. I'm curious to hear about her perspective on the latest on the AI, because she, I'm sure, is interacting with a lot of the early stage startups here in the US. And Alex, joining us online. He's a partner at TCV, which is a global growth stage investor. I think his latest fund size is about $3 billion, if I'm correct. And he invests globally, including Japan, which he made his first investment as TCV in a company called LayerX. So I'm curious to hear his global perspective on what's happening in the startup market. So in this panel, I want to touch maybe three broad topics. The first one is what's happening in the startup landscape in 2026. So as you may all know, AI is creating a big change. So I want to get each panelist's opinion on how it's changing the startup landscape, how it's changing the way startups are founded or operated or invested. And secondly, I want to touch on the US-Japan partnership, which is a theme for the whole conference. The importance between Japan and the US economies are increasing more than ever. And we feel like we can do more in the tech market as well. So what are the opportunities that we see between Japan and the US, especially on the tech context, as well as what are the roadblocks, and how can we better become like a partner? That's the second topic. And the third topic is the future prediction. So what's going to be the future of AI? What's going to be the future of investing? Especially curious to hear how the VC model is changing due to this AI boom. So those are the topics I want to discuss. And also, we want to have ample time for Q&A, because I'm sure you have lots of great questions at the end. So with that, Anne, I want to kickstart with you. So if you could describe, what are some of the recent opportunity that you see in the market? What are the recent investments that you made? What are you most excited about, if you could start with that?
Yeah, I'll just illustrate this with the two most recent investments that I've made. I generally make about 4 to 6 investments per year, so I'm going to describe the 2 investments I've made so far in 2026. The first is a healthcare investment, and this is a company started by someone who is a founder, who is a operator at One Medical, which is a healthcare company here in the United States, and then the number 5 person who joined Instacart. So he's a very good, sort of very early stage engineer. And this company is providing what I would call a business in a box to nurse practitioners. So what does that mean? In the United States, we have actually a massive shortage of doctors, primary care doctors that you would usually go to with your family. And so there are nurses who are taking on that role. And it turns out actually nurses are very business-minded. And so instead of just setting up a regular practice, they will set up a weight loss clinic. And they will give you GLP-1s, and they can prescribe them. They will set up also a therapist business. And so they have sort of other ways in which they're engaging a unique niche audience. And so as they become independent practitioners, they need actually a new way of operating their business. They need a way to get insurance to pay them. They need a way of figuring out how to keep electronic health records. And so we invested in this company to help nurse practitioners become independent business owners. How AI comes into play here is that some of the early engineering is actually completely rebuilding and unbuilding some of the old school traditional ways of building these businesses. And so as an example, the electronic health record, you used to have to actually license it from someone else. And they actually did initially, but it turns out the customers hated it. And so over Christmas break, the CTO was traveling actually to Thailand and was on a plane with his 2 little kids and his wife. And in his break, decided to see if the LLMs would be able to build a better EHR system. And it turns out it can. So on a plane flight to and from, he generated something that I would have never allowed any of my startup companies to ever build and deploy out to customers, but we're actually doing that this time. The second company is distinctly AI native. So this company, there are 2 PhD students from Stanford their expertise is in AI and safety. And just as a little bit of background, I have a PhD in cybersecurity and math modeling, particularly around risk assessment from Stanford. And so this company had some academic research very close to the area that I had done work on. And they were trying to figure out what would happen when an autonomous vehicle hits the road. How safe is it? And the question was, what's the business model? Well, it turns out that if they are able to observe the simulation software that all autonomous vehicles will actually go through, they can actually start to identify that on a particular route, there's a certain kind of risk involved, and they can price that risk. And so in the United States, you're required to have automotive insurance, but the big question is, if no one's behind the wheel, what are you actually insuring? And so they are actually taking the simulation data and they're able to actually ensure that autonomous system, so whether it's a robot operating within a warehouse or a freight truck going down 101, they're able to now actually assess that risk, price it, and provide insurance. So those are 2 examples.
Thanks for the examples. Those are great. You mentioned AI native startups, and I assume you've been investing since '08, so close to 20 years. What are the biggest difference between the recent AI native startups as well compared to the, I guess, previous generation of startups in terms of the product development, go-to-market, or maybe founder profile?
I think it's almost all different. So part of the reason I started Floodgate was I was 2 years out actually from graduating from my PhD program, and I had servers that I was running for my research group. And I hated these servers because they would always go down or we had to service them. And so I wanted to put things in the cloud, and the cloud was brand new at the time. 2006 is when AWS launched. And we could tell that at that moment, startups were going to be actually developed in a totally new way. And it turned out that in those days, a founder would have to sell 50% of their company for $5 million. And I could tell that that requirement for capital was going to be drastically lower. In fact, we were finding founders asking for $500,000. And the path of actually developing that turned into the lean startup. And when I was at Stanford, we were teaching this class that I think 16 years ago we launched. It was called the Lean Launchpad. So Steve Blank and me and one other venture capitalist, we started this class at Stanford called the Lean Launchpad. And it was all about how do you develop the business model and iterate on it. And this class actually is still being taught at Stanford. And what's really interesting to me is that that process now almost feels old. In fact, you know, the way we used to describe it is you had to go out and talk to a bunch of customers, you had to build a minimum viable product, and then like test it out a little bit more. And this learning cycle actually took maybe 3 or 4 weeks when we really pushed the students. What I'm finding these days with startups is that That learning cycle has now compressed down to 1/3 to 1/5 of what we've seen in the past. That includes finding customers, talking to them, building out the product, figuring out what the business model is, testing that out, coming back and reorienting around, and then actually launching, 5 to 10 simultaneous experiments against the same question. What that means is that when the learning cycle is days or maybe a week versus weeks or months, you start to see this really interesting compounding effect around learning. And now the startup is being built at an exponential pace. So as an example, we're seeing an account executive actually think about tooling that they need to build out their practice of sales on a faster basis. We're seeing marketing people actually completely automate their dashboards. We're seeing trouble ticketing in linear being called by agents and then automatically fixing a problem. And that fix is then sent to an engineer or a designer who then reviews it and then actually incorporates it into the code base. But this is all happening in this sort of seamless way, all sort of coordinated through Slack and linear. So the workflows are different, but also the learning cycles are different. And so therefore the organizations that we're seeing are also totally different.
Exciting time for the startups. Alex, so you are a growth investor, and I'm sure you're looking at global market as well. It's the same question. What are some of the exciting opportunity for you? And also as a global investor, do you see different opportunity coming out from different region?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot happening globally. I'd say a lot of the focus is obviously on everything that's happening around AI. Where we are seeing a lot of interesting opportunities is in a number of different kind of verticals, combined with the fact that AI is now kind of allowing you to tap into not just software budgets, but also increasingly labor budgets, where people are coming out with solutions where either processes that have been done very manually can be done with a lot less people, or in some cases, you can do the same amount of work and scale up a function without actually needing to add more people. We are seeing, we invest globally, so roughly half of what we do would be in the US and the rest would be international across Europe and now also in Japan. And I think what we find helpful is we're across a lot of these kind of emerging business models, we're seeing similar companies try and tackle those problems, whether it's in the US or Europe or even Japan. And so being able to kind of compare what's working across different markets, which business models are the most interesting, and also for the companies we speak to in Japan, like for example LayerX, to be able to share what we see working with people in the US and Europe is quite interesting for them as they think about their product roadmap and where they want to take their development next.
You mentioned LayerX. So that was, I think, the first investment as a TCV into a Japanese startup. What was so special about LayerX? What excited you about them?
Yeah, it was a number of different things. So historically, we hadn't spent as much time on looking at things in Japan because there weren't many growth stage private rounds. Companies went public much earlier on. But over the last few years, we did start to see more interesting companies come up, and so made a more concerted effort to meet all the venture and growth stage companies. And LayerX specifically really stood out to us. And what helped was we've invested in and evaluated a lot of similar business models in the rest of the world. So for us, it was more about getting familiar with the Japanese market nuances and their positioning in the team. And what we found interesting was that the Japanese market was actually quite open So a lot of the market isn't even using any software. There's still a lot of manual processes, and the existing vendors in their space, which is finance automation software, so accounts payable, accounts receivable, spend management. There were a couple of very legacy players, and then a big part of the market was still very much open. But we also saw that the adoption of software has started to increase more broadly in Japan for a number of reasons. And so that made for quite an interesting market setup. And then the team was probably the most important thing for us. So not just Fukushima-san, the CEO, but also the broader talent they were attracting really impressed us. And this is always important for us when we make investments, but especially for first investment in a country where we're not on the ground, we don't speak the language. That was something we really focused on, and the team referenced very well, but we also spent quite a lot of time in person with them before investing. So we flew over twice to Tokyo to spend a week with them in person. And the strength of the team really translated into very strong product velocity. So as we kind of compared LayerX to players like Ramp and others in Europe, is that we saw they're actually doing even more than some of the players internationally are doing already. So the company's been really good at releasing new products and really driving customer adoption of that as well. And then overall, the company had very impressive metrics, and importantly, especially nowadays, also strong AI capabilities. So both Fukushima-san and Matsumoto-san, the two founders, have very technical backgrounds, but they're also attracting a lot of AI talent to their team. So all of that made us quite excited as a first investment to partner with them.
I hope it's going to be a first of many investments that
Yes,
I made.
we hope so as well.
In Japan. So Nori, so can you describe a little bit about Kotoba? You know, what's the vision? What kind of opportunity you've seen, and also as an AI researcher as well as the founder, what surprised you most about the AI development in the last, I would say, a year or so?
Yeah, I guess first of all, please invest more in Japan. Yeah, but I guess and Alex provided a very holistic experience of changes in AI. Probably this year and the past few years, I want to probably provide like more ground level perspective as a startup founder. And I guess just to put the more colors on what I'm going to say, Kotoba started as a research lab focusing on real-time speech AI. We do operate business both in the US and Japan. And in the US, we do license out the model we built to Fortune 500 companies, big tech, and the smartphone providers, and the mega ventures. Those are the stuff we do in the US. And in Japan, as Emre mentioned, we are focusing more about the product-based collaboration. We do provide our simultaneous translation app to the prosumers. We tend to work with large companies, but it's really based on the product. I guess for the past 1 or 2 years, there are two strong changes I'm feeling as a startup founder. And the first thing is a very significant change in the market shift toward East Asian countries. So when we started Kotoba, we didn't feel like too much attention to Asian markets, especially Japan. But I guess especially this year, we are getting a very strong tailwind from the US or South Korean companies interested in East Asian markets. Like when I say East Asian markets, those are the countries like Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. And it's kind of surprising, not only the large traditional enterprises, but also the mega ventures whose valuations are around maybe 10 billion, 1 billion is committing seriously to those market, including localization. Those are the one surprising changes I'm feeling these days. And another thing is clearly more focused toward voice AI. When we first started using ChatGPT, it's always about text-based interface. But clearly, AI is expanding more than just facing to the laptop or just smartphone. People are trying to deploy AI everywhere, including just phone or more interfaces like smart AI glasses and even electronics. So running everything on the speech AI, having a speech AI interface is getting a lot of tractions, and those are the major key changes I'm feeling for the past 2 years.
Great. So you are in a very hot space, AI. But it's very hot, but also very competitive. Question is, what kind of opportunity do you think exists for new startups in a market where like OpenAI and Anthropic and all those like frontier labs are taking so much of the value? I think OpenAI and Anthropic each has a 30 billion ARR that's growing, compounding, accelerating. What kind of opportunity do you think there are for AI startups?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And those are the type of questions I need to answer when I face people like Anne or maybe Alex. But I guess there's always this type of like winner takes all type of discussions, right? But I guess from ground level perspective, Gen AI market is growing and the speech AI market is growing, and there's like always a piece of pie where it's like open for like startup like ours, and I guess for us, like we have a competitor like 11 Labs, like DeepL, and even Google, Apple. Those are gonna be our potential competitors, and we collide sometimes. But I guess the reality is like the market size is like expanding faster than colliding those competitors. And I think the most important thing is just get your technology ready and grow your ARR ASAP. I think as long as you can do that, there's always a path to win.
And I think, as you mentioned previously, maybe focus on a certain vertical, as well as probably speed is always the key to successful startups. I want to move on to this US-Japan tech partnership. And I assume that you invest mostly in the US, but you travel to Japan. What's your view on the Japanese startup scene? And obviously, US is like the center of the innovation tech hub. But what kind of opportunity do you think exists for Japanese startups in the US market?
Yeah, this is something I think about quite a bit. So my heritage is 100% Japanese. So my parents both came from Japan, and I grew up here. But as a child, I used to visit all the time. So I would spend my summers half in Kanazawa and half in Tokyo. And I've been traveling a lot to just sort of try to figure out how to foster entrepreneurship within Japan. And the lens that I actually have, the best lens probably, is just sort of what is it like for a college student. And so I teach a program at Stanford called Mayfield Fellows, and we have 12 students that we pick out of about 250 applicants every year. And they include the way in which the Instagram founders actually met was through this program. And it's been running for about 30 years, which gives you a sense of like they have a more than 30-year entrepreneurial history at Stanford. And part of it is because geographically where it's located. But one other reason is that the university is extraordinarily supportive of founders. So when I was a PhD student, I told my advisor, I think I'm going to start a venture capital firm. And he said, I really hope you finish your PhD. And in that year, I actually became pregnant with my second child. I defended my thesis 6 weeks after I gave birth to my son, and I invested in my first company, right? And why was that possible? A lot of it was because I knew Stanford was behind me. Now, I actually teach a class at Stanford of why not to be a founder. Because if you ask that entire class, and I get about 50 students, more apply actually to get into that class. On the first day when you say, how many of you want to be founders? 100% of these students raise their hand, right? And I have to give a speech about why not to drop out of Stanford. Because you know what? A lot of students want to drop out of Stanford as soon as they hit on their first entrepreneurial idea. So why is that the case? Number one, there is an ethos and a bravery associated with starting a company and taking that risk. And I remember actually when I said I was starting Floodgate, one of the things my mom worried about was, what will we tell our relatives? What is Anne doing after her PhD? She's starting a company no one has ever heard of. And this is a big worry for her because my grandmother would be worried. And my aunts would be worried, and our cousins wouldn't know where I was working. And so the social capital of what I was doing was nearly zero. And so actually changing that culture is very important. Providing, a light for people like Noriyuki-san is actually like really, really important. And so I think that's the first thing. But the second thing is actually, having growth capital instead of having companies exit at an earlier stage. I think providing people with the runway to take even more risk to become even larger is important. And the last thing I would say is having entrepreneurs actually come out to the United States is quite important. And I've actually been seeing a lot of Japanese angels and accelerator programs here in San Francisco, bringing cohorts of entrepreneurs out for months at a time. And I think just sort of drinking the water and being in the cafe where everyone's talking about startups is really critical.
Thanks, Alex. Alex, so Anne talked about the growth capital. How can we excite you more about Japanese market? What kind of companies do you want to see coming out from Japan that you would like to invest? What kind of sectors do you think Japan has a strength in the global market that you look at?
Yeah, I think it depends quite a bit on the business model, but I'd say there's probably two categories that we think are interesting. One is more of like the local Japanese champions. So because Japan is a market that has very strong barriers for international companies to enter, that leaves a lot of room to kind of build business models that have worked elsewhere in the world and scale those. And given Japan's, I think, the fourth largest economy in the world, you can build very interesting businesses just doing that. The other bucket would be, which we are increasingly seeing companies kind of emerge, is companies that have started in Japan, but in particular areas where it's, for example, manufacturing or deep tech, where Japan has a lot of unique expertise. And a big kind of home market to kind of build from, but then actually take that technology internationally and go to the US, go to Europe, and really build a global business. I think that's still an earlier stage for a lot of companies, but if you can get that right, I think there's a lot of kind of knowledge in Japan in some of these particular sectors that can be a real advantage when competing with other players globally.
So for the second camp, so those startups with the global ambition, should they secure the home market first, which is Japan? As you said, there's a natural barrier to entry. Maybe competition is not as intense as in the US or other markets, and then go to global? Or would you prefer them, or do you think it's better for them to target global market from day one?
Yeah, I do think it's there is probably, for a lot of those companies, an unfair right to kind of win the customers in Japan, and having some big credible customers you can that you've won and that you can show to companies in the US, I think will make it a lot easier to win those international customers. So I do think it's important to get some level of traction locally first, but it is important both from a product and an organization and ambition point of view to think kind of globally from the beginning. And I started out my investing career in London and spent most of the last 10 years internationally, even though I'm in the US now. But the big thing I've seen with international companies that have done well is there tend to be US players that, because the market here is so big, all they're focused on is the US. And then when they get really, really large, it's quite hard to then suddenly expand internationally when your whole product and organization is kind of set up just to serve the US. And so I have seen international companies actually that from an early stage kind of build globally and build that infrastructure and their product that way, actually have more success building a really global business than some of the US players who are just focused on this market. So I think it is important from the beginning to think that way, but getting some of the credibility from local customers should make it easier to kind of get traction internationally.
Okay. So Nori, I think that's exactly what you're doing, going global from day one, targeting both Japan as well as US. you're doing both, business both in both markets. What are the differences that you see between Japan and the US? And what are the challenges that you faced or overcame as a Japanese startups doing business in the US?
Yeah, yeah. Clearly, I guess as a early, phase startup perspective, the biggest advantage of like being in the U.S. or like U.S. market is having access to revenues. Essentially, if you're in the U.S. like doing AI company, seeking like 7-digit revenue or like even like 8-digit revenue for large enterprises is not that hard. We're not the only company like achieving such a level of revenue. But I guess like on the other hand, if you try to seek the similar opportunities in Japan, like it's almost impossible. Like if you have a very, very strong connections to like exceptionally large enterprises with a sort of like empty contract, just numbers, but without contents. So I think being in the US will definitely give you a good kickstart for the revenue growth, and that's gonna essentially give you attractions in terms of like more fundraising opportunities, like getting attracting more people, like good talents, that kind of thing. And this kind of like holistic package is going to be exceptionally helpful. Sorry, what is the second question? What was the second question?
What are the challenges that you face as a Japanese founder doing business in the US?
No, I guess like one of the reasons like most of the Japanese founders struggle in the US is like the fact that they don't have a proficiency in speaking in English and communicating in English, pitching in English. This is very simple, but I think you need to have that, really. Maybe Anken and is nodding. Yeah, I see that. And it's not only about language proficiency, like in my opinion. Like you need to grow up in the environment where the competition is there from the day one, right? And I guess the fact that I did my undergrad and the PhD in the US really helped me doing a startup here.
Well, I guess the language problem you are solving yourself with the kotoba application.
Yeah, I guess that's a complicated part, right? Like whenever we build this kind of like AI-powered simultaneous translation, people do ask, like, do I really need to learn language, stuff like that? That's a really interesting question. But I guess, two things, like, the fact that you can speak English and the fact that you can actually go into the culture in the startup field, this like mindset of competition is like totally different things. So I think our technology could be helpful, but not enough probably.
I mean, I was just going to say the same thing. I think there's a difference in hearing the language and being able to understand versus really being a part of that culture. And if you're building a company, you're building a culture as much as you're understanding your team members. And so I think there's a layer that you can't get around of the language barrier.
I want to move on to the future prediction before going into Q&A. Nori, you are both founder as well as AI researcher. What's your prediction on this AI development in the next 12 months?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So yeah, before doing a startup, I was an AI researcher by myself. And for people who know like AI development in past 10 years, maybe, they essentially like, 3 major fields for the development AI. Essentially, it's going to be like visual perception, text processing, and also speech. Those are the essentially like mainstream where the most of the development in AI was happening. In the next 12 months, we're going to be actually losing the most of R&D needed to be done by human researchers. The field progresses that fast. So I guess like my prediction is going to be the critical like AI model development, at least for those mainstream tasks, is going to be probably completed like within 12 months to 24 months. Of course, there's a need for localization. You need to run not only the data center, but also on the edge devices. Those kind of, last mile innovation will still happen. But I guess for like mainstream R&D, the goal is getting there. So afterward, it's really about the competition in the application layer and the business layer. And yeah, a lot of exciting things is going to happen. But I think the whole structure of like AI research, AI development is going to be changing fundamentally.
And same question to you. What do you think is going to be the big theme for the next, I would say, 12 months, let's say?
I think just kind of along these lines, one of the really interesting dynamics of these companies is I think you can see companies getting to market caps of $50 billion and then going to zero. Just because the ability for these other companies, the foundation model companies to come in and just eat your lunch is insane, right? Like I think 6 months ago, most of the companies I walked into were using Cursor. And then now we don't see that as much anymore. Everyone's now on Claude, right? And it's really remarkable to see the shifts and changes that happen, and you just don't know. It's almost like being on quicksand. You just don't know where the foundations can really be built, and so that makes it really hard for the investors. And so for early stage, we're sort of saying, okay, like these, you could sell along the way, right? And so it doesn't have to get to an IPO, but we worry about sort of longevity of these companies.
How about you, Alex?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point because for us as growth investors, we used to, when we might be investing at 2 billion or 5 billion or 10 billion valuation, you wouldn't have to worry about the company potentially not being around in a few years. But there's both a lot more upside for the companies that get it right, but there will also definitely be big companies that will get commoditized, and things are changing so quickly that it's definitely a very exciting, but also a challenging time. But I think another thing over the next kind of 12 to 24 months that will, I think, impact also how a lot of companies ultimately have to sell these solutions that have a lot of values. But a lot of traditional companies are only just beginning to start to implement AI, and to really kind of get the benefits of what's possible, there will be a lot of change management that will need to happen. A lot of our kind of tech companies are early adopters, but in terms of the overall economy, they're barely using kind of the capabilities that are even out there today. So also I think the companies that end up doing best will be able to get those traditional companies to really adopt and see the value of their products, which is not an easy thing.
So last question before moving on to Q&A. So to Anne, you mentioned that you started Floodgate with the thesis that 500K is the new 5 million because of the cloud and everything. And you mentioned this AI is also going to be maybe as big of a change, maybe even bigger change than the cloud. What do you think will be the change to the VC investment model given this AI trend? How can we, as a VC investor myself, how can we make sure that we stay competitive in this new era?
Yeah, I think it actually begs the question of, it looks like venture capital itself as an asset class is turning into many different types of assets, and it's all clumped into one, right? I would argue that many of the late stage investors who are investing into Anthropic, OpenAI, and these types of companies, they're kind of like creating the new S&P 500, right? And then there's sort of this other group of investors who are like us, we're like at the very early stages. And some of the things I think about is like, maybe there won't be a ton of companies that get to the 100 billion, $1 trillion mark. But as an investor who's getting in at $10, $20 million valuation, I don't really need that. But there might be a lot of companies that get to $50, $100 million, and they're really great businesses. And if we don't push them to become $1 billion revenue businesses, they may actually be much more sustainable. What is the actual type of financial instrument that can support that? The second trend I would say is that we've been seeing sort of power shift from the top down over time. So it was originally in limited partners, then it got to investors, and then it went from investors down to founders. And my thesis is actually, it's going to actually push down into employees, because especially like in these early stages where you don't need that many more employees anymore because of AI, the actual people you get will be extraordinarily valuable and hard to attract. And they're going to rebel against, well, I just get 1% of the company, right? And so I think there's going to be other ways in which founders will have to attract that great talent. They're not going to be able to say, well, I get secondaries and you guys don't get to know about it. I think there's going to have to be new mechanisms to more equalize that power dynamic. And so I'm excited for what it means, but I think it's not just 500,000 is the new 5 million. It's not as simple as that. I think there's new ways in which we're going to have to bifurcate the asset class.
Great. So with that, I'd like to move on to Q&A and discussion. If you have any questions, please raise your hand. Keep your questions under 30 seconds. Please state your name and who the question is for, and then your question, please. We'll take maybe 2 or 3 questions at once.
Yeah, please don't count this time. Anyway, I'm Takeshi Homa. I have a question for Anne. If you want to start a new BC firm tomorrow, how do you utilize AI power? Like you don't have to hold 100 people like Andres and Holabits anymore. So like you have to start maybe solo GP from LP fundraising to the sourcing. So what is the best way to utilize AI for the new BC firm?
This is a yeah.
That's a great question. Let's take 2 or 3 questions at once.
Okay.
Yeah. Over there, yes. Gentleman who's raising hands, yeah.
Yes, hi. This is for founders and also investors, I guess. Is SaaS dead? I don't think so, but I would like to hear your opinion on someone who's invested in SaaS and also has a company that actually has to have a portion of revenue coming in from SaaS. So that's my question.
Okay, with SaaS dead. Maybe one more question on from this side. I'll take the next question from these sides. Maybe gentleman there.
So what I keep hearing about AI is that there's an incredible demand for power and a bigger power grid. Where does that expense show up for startups? Are you just not paying it because you're on some platform that doesn't charge you for it? And what are the risks associated with increases in the cost of power?
Okay, great. So maybe one question each, so Anne can take the first question. Is SaaS dead? I'll ask Alex to answer, and the last question on the AI cost, Nori.
Just really quickly, we're a small firm, so we have 11 people, and the thing that we found is that you can use AI to source companies. You can use AI to actually find completely new ways in which connections between ideas can be found. So right now I have granola running on all of the meetings that we take. So then it creates a transcript. It gets fed into my knowledge management system. Every day my agent goes through and processes that. It then extracts information and puts it in. If I have a board meeting, it takes that email and it tells me all the questions that I should be asking. Everything is automated for me right now with this background agent that is creating connections between knowledge for me, and it will push it out to me. And then any meeting I take with a deal, it is taking a markdown file of my other partners, and it will tell me, what would Mike Maples have said if he were in that meeting, right? And so I think there's just sort of really interesting ways of automating. I've seen other sort of private equity firms create fake agents that are in the voice of actually one of the partners doing all the cold calling. And so he was like, I don't need analysts anymore because all the cold calling is done by my agents. And so I think there's really interesting ways in which these operations can be automated. But ultimately, like, the beauty of it is the judgment call, right? It's like there's a gut call about meeting a human being and saying that person's a great founder. And I'm not sure an agent's going to ever be able to get that.
Alex, can you answer the question, is SaaS dead? As well as maybe the first question, how you are using at TCV, AI to make decisions.
Yes, on how we're using AI, there's definitely a lot of ways similar to what Anne mentioned. We also use it a lot in our research about particular markets as a way to really go a lot deeper on specific topics. And there's even, for example, you can have access to kind of call transcripts or reports, market reports, and you can aggregate a lot more information and get insights from them in a much more automated way. So there's all throughout the stack, from kind of sourcing to diligence to that it can be very helpful and make you more efficient. On the topic of SaaS, it's obviously a big topic at the moment. In a lot of ways, it's still very early in terms of the actual impact, and things are moving and changing very quickly. I think the one extreme end of the view would be kind of what Nori was saying, that all software development in 12 months is kind of commoditized and infinitely scalable, and so you can replicate everything. On the other hand, there are probably a bunch of models that are more defensible, whether they're kind of system of record, proprietary data, distribution. There's a bunch of areas there that could make companies more defensible. How we kind of think about it is both kind of defensive and offensive. There should be companies out there that, if they move fast enough on the opportunities that are now available with AI, and given they have a big sticky install base, they should be able to be beneficiaries, just like through previous technology shifts. Some of the incumbents have come out better. But we've also seen it with some of our companies. The cultural change is hard. We're seeing startups now with 5 or 10 people move much faster than much larger companies with bigger teams. So ultimately, will, I think, come down to execution. I think some companies will definitely struggle, but there will also be areas where I think some of the existing players should be able to be beneficiaries, but it will take several quarters, I think, for some of that to really show up also in some of the public companies.
And Nori, on the AI cost?
This is actually my favorite question. I guess, first of all, GPUs are expensive, right? As a matter of the fact, like 60 to 80% of our expenses are dedicated to renting GPUs. And when we think about GPUs, like we have 2 workloads, like one for training models, the other one for inference, essentially like hosting AI models for providing services. At least for training, Japanese ecosystem is helping company like ours. Japanese, government, like department like METI is like actively supporting startup like ours to develop AI models in Japan. There's like huge subsidiary coming from them, and that's really helping us. That is one thing. But still, my job as a CEO of an AI startup is finding cheap GPUs, right? Cheap and reliable GPUs, very important. Another thing is like inference. Inference cost is very expensive too. Whenever you run AI models, you need to pay for GPUs for cloud computing providers like Microsoft, Google, like AWS, any providers you choose. One thing interesting about AI and a model inference is that AI is getting very capable, and it can replace more creative, more complicated, more human-like jobs. So you can actually charge people more than the traditional actually search services. So for example, in our case, like we do provide a simultaneous translation tool for prosumers in Japan, right? And we actually do charge people $99 per month. This is absurdly expensive as an iOS app or like Android app, but people still do pay for it. I guess my point is like, the value of AI is actually getting increased. So certainly GPUs are expensive, but I guess the capability of the AI is also increasing. So you can kind of like match up the cost you have to pay for GPU as a service. That is one perspective. But given that said, GPU is a very tricky issue. When we work with a cloud computing provider like Microsoft, they have a data center everywhere, right? Like Israel, like South Africa, or like Sweden. When Iran shoot a missile to Israel, that really froze my heart a little bit, because I was like, oh shit, we're using a training data center there. What's going to happen to that? So it's a really complex global problem. That's why your question is one of my favorite.
Okay, great. Let's do another round, maybe on this side. 1, 2, and 3.
Hi, my name is Dirk Stapel. I work for a Japanese company and also run the corporate venture fund for that company. So my question is to Noriyuki-san. There was the Japanese government created this agency for digital promotion, I think 5 years ago. So when you look at AI companies and companies that are providing services like yours, is Japan finally getting ready, or do you still see a big gap compared to the US ecosystem as an example?
Great question. And here.
We started to see some one-person unicorn. Do you come across with any startups with the founder, human founder, but AI CEO? If that starts to prevail more and more, do you find the human CEO, the real human CEO, value more than AI company?
You want to take the question? Okay. Yeah, we have one more. And one more? Yes.
Hi, I'm Yasu, the founder of a cybersecurity startup based in Japan. So my questions are about tech giant like Google, Microsoft, Amazon. Do you think these tech giants keep expanding their power, after the era of AI?
Okay, great three questions. Okay, Nori-san, do you want to start? Is Japanese AI application ready? And Alex, I will ask you to answer two questions.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question to think about. Yeah, for Kotoba, we are relatively more toward like AI model provider rather than application service company. But we have an honor to work with many application companies like interested in like Asia market. Some trend we are seeing is, we have a lot of Japanese engineers and Japanese researchers. So ideally, Japanese companies should be the first one reaching out to us and working together, right? But right now the status quo is maybe like 80 to 90% of the company, which we actually provide a service or like having a discussion, is a US company interested in East Asia market. So I guess in that perspective, Japanese application layer is still in a RE phase. But still, given that said, I think we started seeing some exciting companies in the AI space. Actually, Layer X is like one of the example. They're actively like working on this like, AI automation space for the call center. And I see a couple of others. So we get to know the answer maybe like next 2 or 3 years, whether actually, foreign companies dominate the Japanese market or maybe Japanese company take the leverage. Like we'll see.
Do you want to take the second? Oh, do you want second and third, maybe 2 questions? Yeah.
With respect to the second question, I think for me the role of the CEO is not just execution. The role of the CEO is hiring a great team. It's like a great general, right? Like it's like motivating the forces and like setting a strategy. And I think that AI is extraordinary execution. If you tell it what to do, it does a great job at doing it. But it is not great at motivating people. It is not great at causing someone to do something that they otherwise wouldn't do. It's not great at setting culture. And so my belief is that that's what the CEO really exists to do. And I hope that that's the continuation of it. I've never thought that startups is just pure science. There's an art to it. It's the knowing when to pivot. It's knowing when to dig in, even though the data doesn't tell you to, right? And so the art of that is still very, very human.
And do you also want to touch on the Yasu's question, whether the tech giants are going to keep expanding in this age of AI?
It's a really tricky question because I do actually believe in the power of the large companies, but they have not executed as well as I thought they should, right? A really good example of that is Apple. I mean, they have all of my data. They know everything about me, and yet they don't take advantage of it. Google even, I would really love for them to be helping me use Gemini across more of my own personal data, and I'm not able to do that. So I turn to other platforms. So you see the power of these platforms. They are operating much more cautiously, but they could turn that almost at any point. And so I think we're still waiting to see when some of these giants will really awaken. I think the one that's the most interesting in terms of how they've been operating is Google.
Alex, do you want to add your perspective?
Yeah, I'd say they're obviously very strong, the hyperscalers, but all of those companies are also very much focused on building their ecosystem because they benefit of people, building on AWS or Google or similarly Anthropic, they want companies to build on their platforms and scale themselves. So although I think they'll continue to be very, very important and probably continue to just get bigger and bigger, they benefit from the overall market growing and building on them. So I don't think that would come at the expense necessarily of a lot of innovation and other companies.
Okay, let's do the last round of questions. 1, 2. Any other questions? Okay, maybe those last two. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Naoki, running a mobility startup in Japan. I have a question to Anne. I found your discussion around the longevity of a new technology and startup interesting. So any implication to startup financing strategy? Because change that happens a lot. So and also the impact to VC's investment strategy.
Thank you. I'm Kohei from Tokyo. I would like to ask to Nori-san. I'm so excited about X real-time translation in X. I believe it's going to create a massive cultural fusion, especially between Japan and the US. What kind of synergy do you anticipate once the barrier is gone?
So we're actually operating exactly the way we always have, and it is a little bit unusual for a seed stage firm. We have a separate partner who actually evaluates every single follow-on financing, and for the last 10 years, we have had that person actually look at the company after we invest, 6 months in, 12 months in, 18 months in, and then for every single subsequent follow-on round. And together with the partner who is invested in that company, we are saying, are we a buyer or a seller? In certain parts, like when we achieve a certain return, we are actually always a seller to a certain extent. And the whole question is, how aggressively are we a seller? And so because of that, like we don't actually have a signaling risk because half the time we're selling because we achieved some level of returns, and the investors who are part of that pool actually want to own more of those companies. And so we have a really good history of like great companies that we're actually selling into, and sometimes we actually want to sell more of our position, right? And as a result of that, we have an actual embedded practice of thinking through valuations and when do we actually capture some of the value in actual returns back to our limited partners. We're seeing more seed stage investors want to get out early, but I think without that practice of like, why are you actually exiting your position, you could actually really have a detrimental effect to your returns because sometimes you're selling positions in your very best companies and they're going to continue to ride. And there's no way to actually build a position that we believe that a venture capital firm has to return 7 to 10x back to their investors in order to be a top performing investment. And so you can't get to a 7 to 10x return on a $150 million fund unless you're holding some of your very best positions, even if you're selling a little bit along the way. So I think those are some practices that people are going to really have to think through.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Yeah, simultaneous translation, building simultaneous translation is so addictive. There's a reason I'm gonna say this. Yeah, whenever like we work on speech AI, there's always a discussion that whether we should be focusing on more larger markets such as like speech agent, and there's like some investor telling us like simultaneous translation is like too small market, which I disagree personally. But I think I love this huge support, especially from a country like Japan. Breaking language barrier is like really critical, and it's actually helping people, and it's really giving us energy. That's good. But I think to answer your question, so I guess like if you observe the current behavior of users of our app, they're using them as a kind of like supporting tool in the daily business meeting, stuff like that. I want to see more like active use cases of simultaneous translation going forward. For example, like Holi-san like gracefully used our translation app to host a English-only panel session in G1 Summit. That kind of like activating like a multilingual communication in a multiple setup is awesome. I think in a workplace, we can use like AI to bridge a gap between like multilingual workers. That kind of like active changes is something we want to see.
Great. I think that's a great place to end. So we, as Globis, we've been investing in Japanese startups for the last 30 years. And right now we are seeing more and more Japanese startups going overseas, mostly US. About 15% of our portfolio companies are already doing business outside of Japan. And we see an investor like Alex making investment in Japan. So I feel like the partnership between the two ecosystems is getting stronger. And probably thanks to Kotoba, the language barrier is going to be torn down soon. So I hope the golden age for the tech alliances is near. So let's thank all the panelists for the great insights. And thanks for the great question as well.